And welcome back with us. We're here at what we call the discussion table, and my name's Robert. I forgot to tell you that a while ago. I'm here with Nick Amberson as well as Josh Watkins, and we are really glad that you have chosen to study with us about faith. Right now we want to talk about the fact that faith is something that's real, and that's sort of an interesting thing for us because it's not necessarily something that I see necessarily. I guess the effects of it are seen, but faith itself is not seen.
Well, that kind of brings up a thing like with air. We think of air, you can't really see what you're waving your arms through, but yet at the same time, if the wind's blowing the leaves outside, you definitely see the effect of the leaves moving. You see them going across the ground, and we can see the power of it through hurricanes and through tornadoes. So air is similar to faith in the fact that it's there, you can't see it, but you see the effects of it.
So I believe that the Bible tells us some things about faith and about what true faith really is. You said that we don't see it. Well, a lot of people say, well, I have faith and I just have faith that God is going to see me through a tough time, or I just have faith that such and such is going to happen. That to me sounds kind of like a wishy-washy sort of thing, rather than just something that is real and that I'm absolutely assured of. So what if we talked about some things that have to do with real faith? If we were going to give some characteristics of real faith, what might we say?
Well, James chapter 2 comes to my mind, how he describes faith as something that we see, something that we do. And he says, some might say that I have faith without works, but he will show you his faith by his works. And I think that that's something that we need to keep in mind. And it's something that drives us to do things for God. And I think it keeps us motivated to keep working for God, just as it did the apostles in Acts chapter 5 when they were beaten, and they picked up themselves and they kept on going and they rejoiced for having been able to suffer. Or even Paul was also beaten and left out for dead, and yet I believe his faith is what picked him up off the ground and kept him moving.
So why it is, I guess you're saying, Nick, that we can't see faith, it's sort of like you said, Josh, we can see the effects of it through the works that we do. And James would teach that in chapter 2. And I guess we'll have more to say about that in just a minute.
I was going to say, this seems like it's a conviction kind of idea, is that if someone is going to, like you referenced Acts 5 with them being beaten and going on rejoicing, that takes some serious guts. That's convicted. Right. I think of Abraham as the father of faith, as God told him, sacrifice your son Isaac, the one you prayed for, the one you really wanted, sacrifice him to me. And Abraham basically says, okay, God. And we know the story. He goes all the way up to the point of taking the dagger, raising it up, and an angel stopping him. So that's conviction, I think.
That's right. Faith seems to be, and I guess those of us who are Christians, we've heard, as we put it, the 5 steps of the plan of salvation. And we always say hearing the Gospels first, and then belief or faith would be second. And faith, I guess, is really the foundation of everything else. In 2 Peter chapter 1, Peter would say, add to your faith virtue, knowledge, temperance, patience, godliness, brotherly kindness, and love. And all of that is added to faith, 2 Peter 1, 5 through 11. And then in Acts chapter 2, where we talk about the day of Pentecost, how many times have we heard about that? And but those people were definitely convicted. In fact, there's no doubt about that. They had done some pretty serious things. And for them to be able to say, listen, we believe, even though Peter and the rest of the apostles had said, hey, the blood of Jesus is on your hands.
But notice their conviction was not just a conviction that said, well, what must we do to take care of our sin? Their conviction was something that they were committed to living that life, because you can continue reading from Acts 2. I mean, here's basically Acts 2 area to the end of the Bible. That's the story of people who were committed to their faith.
Right. They absolutely were convicted of the things they had done. When they heard the gospel message in Acts chapter 2, their response in verse 37 was, men and brethren, what shall we do? And they were willing to do it because they were absolutely convicted of the things that they had been told.
I think that conviction, it produces a lot of different things in our lives. And I think, just from biblical example that we've already cited, the Acts 5 thing, we see that it produces a joy. That although they were beaten, they were rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer. And it produces a trust, and it produces a force. It compels us to go on and continue to do the things that we're doing. And I think Paul even points out in Galatians chapter 5, toward the end of the chapter, the fruits of the Spirit, or the fruit of the Spirit. And he says that those things are love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, and faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, and against such things there is no law. And I think that our faith, if it's the true faith that we're supposed to have, produces those things.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
We're kind of talking here. I think that faith is not just something that, it's not just an obedience to rules. And I think sometimes we have a feeling of that, is that it's just this, let's follow what God says.
Right.
But it seems that faith is more than just an obedience to rules. It's a complete reliance upon God and what His will is and His desire for our life is. It is giving everything we've got and saying, God, I know You are the person who can handle these problems. I know You're the person who I should trust in. And I think we oftentimes overlook that to say, well, it's just rules, when it seems that it's more than that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a deep-rooted conviction.
Mm-hmm. And I think that conviction, and we're already hinting on it, I think
Mm-hmm.
is it produces a commitment. If we really believe that these things are what they are, if we really believe God is who He is, if we really trust Him, and we really believe that He's going to hold His promises, whether we do the things He wants us to do and He rewards us, or we don't do the things He wants us to do and He punishes us, then that produces a commitment. If we really have faith in what God says, then we're going to want to do those things, and we're going to keep doing them, a commitment.
So we've talked about faith, and it definitely takes a conviction there. And we've seen people who are convicted, and it definitely takes that commitment. And I think we're getting there. But what about this argument that we hear all the time about perhaps the Bible allegedly contradicting itself? And what about this idea of people saying, "Well, I believe, and that's all I have to do." If I believe in God, if I'm willing to listen to what He says, isn't that it? Faith only, right? What do we think?
I think that if you've got a Bible, Romans chapter 4, prime example of what you're talking about, Robert.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's Romans 4.
Right.
Romans 4. Paul begins discussing the issue of the law and faith, and how your faith, in a sense, is what you need. How he continues would say that it is by the grace of God that you've been saved. And he furthermore would say, it's not by your works that any man should boast. And so we have this idea from Paul in Romans, telling the Romans that it's not by your works, because he'll even say, I believe it's verse 4, he says that if you do work, and if your work is there, then what you receive is as a result of your works, not because God's grace. We have that, I'm going to say problem in quotes for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have what James says in James chapter 2.
Which Nick talked about a second ago.
Yeah, where it's faith and works, and how He's shown me your faith by your works, and that's the evidence there. I think that the way that we can reconcile this is the fact of different audiences, different understanding, not from the perspective of the writer, but from the perspective of who he's writing to. We see that in Romans, Paul is more than likely writing to people who are following the Old Testament, Old Covenant, old laws, and he's saying it's not about that. It's not about following those rules to a T as much as it is about the grace of God, where it seems that James is writing from a perspective of saying, you've got to do something. You can't just be a person who says, well, my faith is all I need. All I've got to do is say I have faith. You've got to actually show it. And so I don't think there's a contradiction there, just different audiences, and the way that we should approach it should be from that perspective.
Well, and it's obvious if we really look at it that they're just writing from almost two different perspectives, but they're saying the same thing. Both of them are not throwing faith, neither of them are throwing faith out the window, but at the same time, neither of them are throwing works out the window. It seems like there's a nice balance in between. So when we think about this idea of faith only, well, I think, Nick, you're the one that hit it on a second ago. If we have faith, then we're going to believe in God's promises. Well, there's some things that God has promised. God has promised, if you live according to my commandments, heaven eternal is your reward for eternity. Okay, I can count on that. I have faith in that. I'm convicted of that. I'm committed to that in my life, and therefore I live faithfully, as we say. I obey His commandments for the rest of my life. But at the same time, just if I have faith, then I'm going to believe God's promise when He says, hey, if you don't do what I say, then eternal punishment in hell is the consequence. The wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23.